Why is there a contractor working on that helicopter? The question floated across Hangar 12 just after sunrise, drawing a few amused smiles from a group of technicians gathered near a maintenance cart. None of them expected an answer. The woman they were talking about did not look like someone interested in conversations. Evelyn Parker stood alone beside an aging utility helicopter parked near the far end of the massive hangar. A faded cleaning cloth moved steadily through her hands as she wiped a thin layer of dust from the aircraft's exterior panel. She wore simple work clothes, practical boots, and a weathered utility jacket that blended perfectly into the industrial surroundings. Nothing about her appearance suggested importance. Forklifts rolled across polished concrete floors. Maintenance crews checked equipment. Radios crackled with routine updates. The morning felt ordinary in every possible way. People passed Evelyn without giving her a second glance. Some assumed she worked for a cleaning contractor. Others thought she was part of a maintenance support team. Nobody seemed interested enough to ask. Evelyn appeared comfortable with that. She worked quietly, moving from one section of the helicopter to another with patient precision. Across the installation, preparations were underway for an important visit. Vehicles moved between buildings. Officers reviewed schedules. Department heads rehearsed briefings. General William Hayes was arriving for an inspection, and the entire base seemed determined to make a good impression. At exactly 8 o'clock, a black government vehicle rolled to a stop outside the hangar entrance. The side door opened, and General Hayes stepped onto the concrete. Years of experience had trained him to notice details quickly. He scanned equipment, personnel, and facilities with practiced efficiency. Few things escaped his attention for long. Accompanied by several officers, he began walking through the hangar. Maintenance supervisors explained readiness statistics and inspection reports while technicians straightened their posture whenever he passed. Hayes listened carefully, occasionally asking short questions that required immediate answers. Then he noticed Evelyn. She stood on a small maintenance platform beside the helicopter, continuing her work without any visible concern for the arrival of a senior commander. For a moment, Hayes watched her in silence. Most people reacted differently when a general entered the room. They worked faster. They stood straighter. They looked nervous. Evelyn did none of those things. "Who is that?" Hayes finally asked. One officer followed his gaze. "Probably a contractor, sir." Hayes nodded slightly. The answer seemed reasonable. He continued walking. Yet something about the woman remained in the back of his mind. There was a calmness to her that felt unusual. Not arrogance. Not indifference. Something else. As the inspection continued, conversations filled the hangar once more. Mechanics reviewed schedules. Engineers discussed upcoming evaluations. Nearby, Evelyn finished cleaning one section of the helicopter and stepped back to examine the aircraft. Her eyes moved slowly across the engine housing and rotor assembly. She studied details that most people would never notice. Then she returned to work. A young technician walked past and glanced at her briefly. "Busy morning?" he asked casually. "Usually is," Evelyn replied. Her voice was calm and unremarkable. The technician nodded and continued on his way. Minutes later, General Hayes found himself looking toward the helicopter again. The woman was still there, still working, still almost invisible to everyone around her. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he felt certain that before the day was over, he would learn something important about the person nobody seemed to notice. The inspection continued through the eastern side of the hangar. General Hayes reviewed maintenance schedules, readiness reports, and equipment inventories while a group of officers followed close behind. On paper, everything looked solid. The numbers matched expectations. Deadlines were being met. Personnel evaluations were positive. Yet Hayes still found his attention drifting back toward the woman beside the helicopter. He disliked distractions during inspections. Experience had taught him that small details often revealed larger truths. The challenge was knowing which details mattered. Across the hangar, Evelyn Parker stepped down from the maintenance platform and slowly walked around the aircraft. Her eyes moved across the fuselage, then toward the engine housing. She paused briefly near an access panel before continuing. Nothing about her behavior appeared dramatic. In fact, it was almost impossible to notice unless someone was specifically watching her. Most people were too busy preparing for the inspection to pay attention. A maintenance supervisor approached General Hayes carrying a digital tablet. "Sir, tomorrow's evaluation flight is fully scheduled and ready to proceed." Hayes accepted the tablet and reviewed the summary. The helicopter Evelyn had been cleaning appeared near the top of the list. "Everything cleared?" Hayes asked. "Yes, sir. No issues reported." The supervisor sounded confident. Hayes handed back the tablet and glanced across the hangar once more. At that exact moment, Evelyn stopped walking. Her attention remained fixed on the helicopter. Several seconds passed. Then she quietly spoke, almost as if she were thinking out loud. "That aircraft is not flying tomorrow." The words were calm. Matter of fact. No emotion. No attempt to attract attention. Unfortunately for everyone nearby, the hangar had fallen unusually quiet during a pause in conversation. Several technicians heard her immediately. A few exchanged amused looks. One mechanic chuckled. "That is interesting," he said. "Considering the inspection reports say otherwise." Evelyn turned toward him. "Inspection reports do not always tell the whole story." The mechanic smiled politely. "And what story are we missing?" For a moment, she looked toward the engine housing again. "A pattern." The answer only generated more confusion. Nearby technicians began whispering among themselves. Some assumed she was guessing. Others believed she was simply repeating something she had overheard. General Hayes listened carefully. He had expected confidence from pilots, engineers, and commanders. He had not expected it from a woman everyone believed was a contractor. "What kind of pattern?" Hayes asked. Evelyn met his gaze briefly. The kind that becomes obvious when people stop looking at individual reports and start comparing them together. Several officers frowned. The explanation sounded technical. More importantly, it sounded specific. Hayes noticed that she was not speaking like someone offering an opinion. She sounded like someone describing a conclusion she had already reached. The maintenance supervisor folded his arms. "You are saying there is a problem?" Evelyn nodded once. "I am saying someone should check again." Then, without another word, she picked up her cloth and returned to cleaning the helicopter. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. Yet throughout the hangar, curiosity spread from one person to another. And for the first time that morning, General Hayes began wondering whether the quiet woman everyone ignored might know something that nobody else did. The comment lingered in the air long after Evelyn returned to her work. Most people tried to continue with their routines, but the mood inside the hangar had shifted. Curiosity had replaced certainty. Mechanics glanced toward the helicopter more often than before. Technicians exchanged quiet observations. Even the maintenance supervisor seemed less confident than he had been a few minutes earlier. General Hayes noticed all of it. Experience had taught him that confidence was easy when everyone agreed. Real confidence appeared when someone was willing to stand alone. Evelyn had done exactly that. She had challenged an official conclusion without raising her voice, without demanding attention, and without offering dramatic explanations. That made her difficult to dismiss. Several minutes later, the maintenance supervisor walked toward the helicopter carrying a tablet. Two senior technicians followed behind him. "Let us take another look," he said. The word sounded casual, but everyone nearby understood why the additional inspection was happening. Evelyn did not react. She simply stepped aside and continued wiping dust from another section of the aircraft. The technicians opened an access panel and began reviewing diagnostic records. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The numbers remained within acceptable ranges. One technician even smiled as though expecting the review to confirm their original conclusion. Then he stopped scrolling. "Wait," he said quietly. The supervisor looked over his shoulder. "What is it?" The technician enlarged a section of the report. "This vibration reading." Another technician leaned closer. "That was from last month. Look at the trend." The supervisor studied the numbers carefully. His expression changed. The increase was small. Almost invisible when viewed as a single report. But spread across several maintenance cycles, a pattern began to emerge. The exact word Evelyn had used. Pattern. General Hayes watched from several yards away. He could not see the screen, but he could see the reactions. The casual confidence that had filled the group moments earlier was disappearing. More records were opened. More comparisons were made. Nobody laughed now. 10 minutes later, the maintenance supervisor approached Hayes carrying the tablet. "Sir," he said carefully, "there appears to be an alignment issue developing inside the engine assembly." Hayes folded his arms. "Serious?" "Not today." The supervisor hesitated. "But tomorrow's evaluation flight would likely be delayed until further inspection is completed." Silence followed. Around the hangar, word spread quickly. People looked toward Evelyn again. The woman who had seemed invisible that morning had identified a problem before the official review process. Yet she showed no sign of satisfaction. No smile. No attempt to prove a point. She simply continued working as though nothing unusual had happened. General Hayes studied her for several seconds. Then he walked toward the helicopter. "You knew," he said. Evelyn looked up briefly. "I suspected." "Based on maintenance reports?" "Based on details." The answer was frustratingly simple. Hayes almost asked another question. Instead, he stopped himself. Because for the first time that day, he realized the woman everyone assumed was a contractor might understand far more about the aircraft than anyone had imagined. The discovery changed the atmosphere inside Hangar 12 for the rest of the morning. Technicians who had ignored Evelyn now found reasons to walk past the helicopter again. Some glanced toward her openly. Others tried not to. The maintenance supervisor returned to his team and ordered a complete review of the aircraft records. Nobody questioned the decision. General Hayes remained nearby longer than originally planned. That alone surprised several officers. Normally, once an inspection point had been completed, he moved on immediately. This time he stayed. He watched the technicians compare reports and verify measurements. Every new review pointed to the same conclusion. The developing issue had been present for weeks. Small enough to avoid concern. Large enough to matter. Hayes finally approached Evelyn again. She was folding the cleaning cloth she had been using all morning. "You said you suspected the problem," he said. "What made you look in the first place?" Evelyn glanced toward the helicopter. "The maintenance logs." Hayes frowned slightly. "You had access to the logs?" "Some of them." The answer raised more questions than it resolved. Nearby officers exchanged looks. Contractors did not usually spend time studying aircraft maintenance histories. Nor did they identify subtle patterns that experienced technicians overlooked. Yet Evelyn offered no additional explanation. She simply placed the cloth inside a small utility bag and adjusted the strap over her shoulder. A radio call interrupted the conversation. One of the officers accompanying Hayes stepped forward. "Sir, the operations briefing has been moved up 30 minutes. Hayes nodded. The briefing involved senior personnel from multiple departments. Attendance was tightly controlled. Understood, he said. The officer began organizing schedules while the inspection group prepared to leave the hangar. As they started toward the exit, Hayes glanced back one final time. Evelyn was still standing beside the helicopter. For a brief moment, she looked less like a contractor and more like someone conducting her own inspection. The impression vanished almost immediately. Yet it lingered in his thoughts. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off rows of vehicles and administrative buildings. Personnel moved across the base with practiced efficiency. The inspection party entered the operations complex and headed toward the secure conference area. Discussions quickly shifted to logistics, readiness metrics, and upcoming evaluations. Even so, Hayes found himself distracted. Every time a report mentioned maintenance trends or operational forecasting, he remembered the woman in the hangar. Nearly an hour later, as officers gathered outside the secured briefing section, a familiar figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. Evelyn Parker walked calmly toward the same restricted area. Several people noticed her immediately. One lieutenant looked confused. Another assumed she had taken a wrong turn. The secured conference rooms were reserved for authorized personnel only. Yet Evelyn continued forward without hesitation. General Hayes stopped walking. Across the corridor, security personnel were already moving into position near the entrance checkpoint. Whatever happened next, it was becoming increasingly clear that the quiet woman from the hangar belonged somewhere far beyond the role everyone had assigned to her that morning. Security personnel noticed Evelyn long before she reached the checkpoint. The secured conference area was one of the most restricted locations inside the operations complex, and everyone assigned there knew exactly who was supposed to enter. Evelyn Parker was not on any list they recognized. Yet she walked forward with calm confidence, carrying the same small utility bag she had brought from the hangar. There was no sign of uncertainty in her expression. No hesitation. No attempt to explain herself before being questioned. General Hayes watched from several yards away as two security officers stepped forward. Their movements were professional and respectful. "Ma'am, this area requires authorization," one of them said. Evelyn stopped. "I understand. May we see your credentials?" She nodded and reached into her jacket. Several nearby officers expected a standard identification card. Instead, Evelyn produced a slim black credential unlike anything most of them had ever seen. There was no visible rank. No branch designation. No departmental markings. The card looked unusually plain. One officer accepted it and examined both sides. His expression changed almost immediately. Not because he recognized it, but because he did not. "Do you have another form of identification?" he asked. "That one should be sufficient," Evelyn replied. The answer sounded simple. Yet something about the way she said it caused the officer to pause. He handed the credential to his supervisor. The supervisor studied it for several seconds before walking toward a verification terminal mounted beside the entrance. Several authorization screens appeared. Codes were entered. Access databases were searched. The supervisor frowned. Then he tried again. Around the corridor, conversations began to fade. Curiosity spread quickly. Senior officers waiting for the briefing started paying attention. General Hayes folded his arms and observed the process carefully. He had spent decades around secure facilities. He understood how credentials worked. He also understood when something unusual was happening. The supervisor entered additional verification commands. This time the terminal responded differently. A new screen appeared. Then another. The supervisor straightened slightly. One of the security officers noticed the reaction immediately. "Problem?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," the supervisor replied. His voice sounded less certain than before. He continued reading information displayed on the monitor. The expression on his face shifted from confusion to concentration. Then something else. Respect. Nearby personnel noticed the change. So did General Hayes. The supervisor looked toward Evelyn. "Please wait one moment." She nodded. Of course. Not once did she appear frustrated. Not once did she argue. If anything, she seemed entirely unsurprised by the delay. Several minutes passed. More verification procedures followed. The corridor had become remarkably quiet. Finally, the supervisor stepped away from the terminal and returned the black credential with both hands. "Thank you, ma'am." The difference in his tone was impossible to miss. A few officers exchanged puzzled glances. General Hayes took a step closer. "What did the system tell you?" The supervisor hesitated. For a brief moment, it looked as though he was carefully choosing his words. "Sir, I am not authorized to discuss the details." Silence filled the corridor. Nobody expected that answer. Especially not in response to a general. And for the first time that day, General Hayes realized that the mystery surrounding Evelyn Parker was becoming far larger than a helicopter inspection. The corridor remained silent after the supervisor spoke. General Hayes had spent enough years around classified operations to recognize when a conversation had reached a boundary. Even so, the response bothered him. Very few people inside the military system possessed credentials that could not be explained to a commanding general. Yet Evelyn Parker stood calmly beside the checkpoint as though the situation was completely routine. She accepted the black credential and slipped it back into her jacket. No sign of satisfaction crossed her face. No attempt to emphasize what had just happened. If anything, she seemed more interested in reaching the conference room than in the attention surrounding her. Several officers continued watching from a distance. Questions filled the hallway, but nobody seemed willing to ask them aloud. Eventually a new voice broke the silence. "What seems to be the issue here?" An older colonel approached from the far end of the corridor carrying a thin briefing folder beneath one arm. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades inside sensitive assignments. The security supervisor immediately stepped aside. "Sir, we completed credential verification." The colonel nodded. "And?" The supervisor hesitated. "Authorization confirmed." The colonel looked toward Evelyn. His eyes briefly moved to the collar of her weather jacket. For a fraction of a second, something changed in his expression. It was subtle enough that most people missed it. General Hayes did not. The colonel had recognized something. He stepped closer and gave a small respectful nod. Evelyn returned the gesture. Nothing more. No introductions. No explanations. Yet the exchange carried meaning. Hayes could feel it. "Colonel," he said, "do you know this individual?" The older officer considered the question carefully. "I know enough to say she belongs exactly where she is." Several people exchanged confused looks. The answer only deepened the mystery. Before Hayes could continue, the colonel glanced toward the conference entrance. "The briefing begins in 10 minutes. We should not keep everyone waiting." It was not a refusal. It was a redirection. A deliberate one. Evelyn remained silent throughout the exchange. She simply waited. The confidence she projected was unlike anything Hayes had encountered that day. Not the confidence of rank. Not the confidence of authority. Something quieter. The confidence of someone who never needed to prove anything. As personnel began moving toward the secured conference area, Hayes noticed another detail. Several experienced officers who had overheard the conversation were now watching Evelyn differently. Earlier they had viewed her as an outsider. Now there was caution in their expressions. Respect as well. Whatever they suspected, it was enough to change their perception. The conference doors finally opened. One by one, authorized personnel entered the room beyond. Digital displays glowed across the walls. Sensitive planning materials waited on secured systems. As the group moved forward, General Hayes looked toward Evelyn once more. The woman everyone had mistaken for a contractor walked calmly through the entrance without a single challenge. And for the first time that day, Hayes began to wonder whether the most important person attending the briefing was the one nobody had recognized when the morning began. Inside the conference room, people settled into their assigned seats while secure systems completed their final authentication checks. Large displays illuminated the walls with operational maps, readiness reports, and planning schedules. General Hayes took his place near the center of the table. Across from him, senior officers reviewed briefing materials and prepared notes for discussion. Then he noticed something unusual. One chair remained empty. Unlike every other seat in the room, it carried no visible rank designation. No department label. No organizational identifier. It simply waited. The detail seemed minor at first. Yet as more personnel entered, nobody attempted to sit there. The older colonel noticed Hayes looking toward it. He offered no explanation. A few moments later, the conference room doors opened again. Evelyn Parker entered quietly. Conversations softened immediately. She carried the same small utility bag from earlier and wore the same leather jacket that had caused so many people to mistake her for a contractor. Several visitors glanced toward her with obvious confusion. Others watched carefully, remembering what had happened at the security checkpoint. Without hesitation, Evelyn crossed the room and stopped beside the unmarked chair. For the first time all afternoon, General Hayes saw several experienced officers straighten in their seats. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Evelyn placed her bag beside the chair and sat down. Not as a guest. Not as someone uncertain about being there. She sat with the calm confidence of a person occupying exactly the position reserved for her. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Then the display screens changed. Multiple security layers appeared simultaneously. Authentication banners flashed across the monitors before disappearing again. Several systems unlocked that had remained inaccessible only moments earlier. Analysts exchanged surprised looks. One officer checked his tablet twice, convinced he had missed something. The room became still. Hayes watched the displays carefully. New information appeared. Strategic readiness summaries. Integrated assessments. Long-term projections. Data sets that normally existed across separate networks now appeared together as a unified picture. The older colonel folded his hands. There it is, he said quietly. No one asked what he meant. They already knew something important had changed. As Evelyn adjusted the collar of her jacket, a small section shifted beneath the overhead lighting. The movement revealed a symbol partially hidden from view throughout the day. A dark silver insignia shaped around the outline of a nightshade flower. The effect was immediate. One senior advisor stopped speaking mid-sentence. A captain near the far end of the table stared for several seconds before looking away. Even personnel who did not recognize the symbol sensed its significance through the reactions surrounding them. General Hayes noticed the older colonel looking directly at the insignia. Recognition crossed his face instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. I have only seen that emblem once before, the colonel said. Nobody interrupted him. And the people associated with it answered to responsibilities that existed beyond normal reporting chains. Silence followed. Evelyn did not explain the insignia. She did not introduce herself differently. She simply opened her tablet and reviewed the information on the display. Yet at that moment, General Hayes finally understood why experienced officers had reacted so cautiously throughout the day. The mystery was no longer whether Evelyn belonged in the room. The mystery was how important her role truly was. For several moments, nobody spoke. The Nightshade insignia remained visible beneath the edge of Evelyn Parker's collar, and although only a handful of people in the room recognized it, the reactions it produced told everyone else that it mattered. General Hayes leaned back slightly and studied the room. Earlier that morning, most of the people present would have walked past Evelyn without noticing her. Now every eye seemed drawn toward her seat. Yet she appeared completely unaffected by the attention. The large display continued cycling through readiness assessments and operational forecasts. Charts expanded across the screens. Maintenance patterns connected to supply projections. Personnel readiness linked to long-term planning recommendations. Information that normally existed inside separate systems appeared together with remarkable clarity. One analyst quietly shook his head. "I have never seen these data sets integrated like this." Another nodded in agreement. "Neither have I." Evelyn tapped her tablet once. Several highlighted indicators appeared across the display. "These areas require review within the next 90 days, she said calmly. Her voice carried no sense of authority, yet everyone listened immediately. "The issues are not critical today. They become important if ignored." General Hayes looked toward the highlighted sections. To his surprise, one of them involved the same maintenance division responsible for the helicopter she had examined earlier. Another involved logistics planning. A third concerned training schedules. Viewed separately, none seemed alarming. Viewed together, a larger pattern emerged. The realization was impossible to miss. She had been seeing connections long before anyone else. The older colonel watched quietly from across the table. Finally he spoke. "Most organizations examine individual problems." He glanced toward Evelyn. "Some organizations examine systems." Several people understood exactly what he meant. Hayes was beginning to understand as well. The mysterious credential. The unusual access. The hidden insignia. None of it existed because Evelyn occupied a traditional command position. Her responsibility was different. Broader. She was not there to manage a department. She was there to evaluate an entire environment. As the briefing continued, questions shifted. Nobody asked why she was present anymore. Instead they asked for her assessment. Her recommendations. Her observations. Every answer she provided was concise. Precise. Free of unnecessary explanation. She never spoke longer than required. Yet each comment seemed to carry weight. By the end of the session, the atmosphere inside the room had transformed completely. What began as curiosity had become respect. General Hayes noticed it in the way officers addressed her. In the way analysts took notes when she spoke. In the way experienced personnel waited for her perspective before drawing conclusions. The shift was remarkable. Not because Evelyn demanded it. Because she never did. The briefing eventually reached its final agenda item. The main display dimmed slightly as summary recommendations appeared across the screen. Around the table, people reviewed the conclusions in silence. Then General Hayes looked toward Evelyn once more. Earlier that day he had seen a woman cleaning dust from an aircraft. Now he understood that he had never actually seen the whole picture. And as the final reports appeared before the room, one fact became impossible to ignore. The person everyone had mistaken for the least important individual on the base had quietly become the most trusted voice in the meeting. The final briefing slide faded from the display, leaving the room wrapped in a thoughtful silence. For a few moments nobody moved. Officers reviewed notes. Analysts exchanged quiet observations. Advisors closed tablets and organized reports. Yet despite the amount of information discussed during the session, General William Hayes found himself thinking about only one thing. He remembered the first moment he had seen Evelyn Parker that morning. A woman standing beside an aging helicopter. A cleaning cloth in her hand. A faded jacket. An assumption formed within seconds. It seemed almost unbelievable now. Around the conference table, people slowly began gathering their materials. Several officers approached Evelyn to thank her for specific recommendations. Others asked brief questions about implementation timelines and review procedures. She answered each one with the same calm professionalism she had displayed all day. No dramatic speeches. No attempts to emphasize her authority. No reminders about what she had accomplished. Just concise answers and practical guidance. The older colonel watched the interactions with a faint smile. He seemed unsurprised by the respect Evelyn had earned. General Hayes stood and walked toward her side of the room. Conversations softened slightly as he approached. Evelyn looked up from her tablet. "General." Hayes nodded. For a moment he searched for the right words. Throughout his career he had delivered speeches to thousands of personnel. He had briefed government officials and commanded major operations. Yet this conversation felt unexpectedly important. "This morning," he said, "I made a judgment before I understood the facts." The room grew quieter. A few remaining officers paused to listen. Hayes continued. "I saw your appearance. I saw your work clothes. I decided who you were before I ever asked a question." Evelyn listened without interrupting. "That was my mistake." The words were simple. Honest. Direct. Nobody in the room doubted their sincerity. Evelyn closed her tablet and placed it on the table. "Everyone makes assumptions," she said. "The important thing is whether they are willing to reconsider them." Hayes smiled slightly. "I suppose I received that opportunity today." "You did." There was no criticism in her voice. No satisfaction. Just a statement of fact. Somehow that made the moment even more meaningful. One by one, the remaining personnel exited the conference room. Within minutes only a handful of people remained. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the base. The long shadows of aircraft and buildings reached across the pavement. The day was beginning to wind down. Eventually Evelyn collected her small utility bag and prepared to leave. General Hayes accompanied her toward the exit. As they walked through the operations building, personnel who had witnessed the day's events offered respectful nods. Some greeted her by name. Others simply stepped aside. The difference from that morning was impossible to miss. When they reached the main entrance, a vehicle waited near the curb. Evelyn stopped beside it. "Will you be returning?" Hayes asked. She considered the question for a moment. "Perhaps. It depends on where I am needed." The answer sounded exactly like something she would say. Practical. Uncomplicated. Hayes nodded. "Then I hope our paths cross again." A small smile appeared on her face. "If they do, I am sure the helicopter will be cleaner next time." Hayes laughed softly. It was the first completely relaxed moment he had experienced all day. Evelyn entered the vehicle and closed the door. A few seconds later it pulled away from the curb and disappeared beyond the operations complex. General Hayes remained standing there for several moments. Around him, the base continued its normal routine. Maintenance crews worked. Vehicles moved between buildings. Personnel completed the final tasks of the day. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning. Yet something had changed. He had arrived believing that experience allowed him to understand people quickly. He left with a different lesson. Sometimes the most remarkable person in the room is the one nobody notices. Sometimes true expertise arrives without announcements. And sometimes respect is earned not through titles, uniforms, or introductions, but through quiet competence that speaks for itself.